I can help write the article, but I should point out one important issue. The title, Intoxicated Cop Arrested While on Duty, implies a specific real person or incident. To avoid inventing facts about an actual officer, I'll write it as a general educational and narrative-style article about a scenario involving an on-duty officer arrested for intoxication, focusing on traffic stop realities, police procedures, accountability, and driver interactions. Intoxicated cop arrested while on duty. The blue lights appeared so suddenly that for a split second, nobody quite understood what they were seeing. Cars began moving aside. Drivers slowed down. A few people glanced into their mirrors, assuming another routine police response was rushing through traffic. Then something strange happened. The patrol vehicle drifted toward the shoulder. It corrected, then drifted again. A moment later, it crossed the lane marker one more time. The people watching probably assumed the officer was distracted. Maybe he was checking information on the computer. Maybe he was responding to a call. Maybe there was a reason. But what if there wasn't? What if the person behind the badge was impaired? Before we get into this situation, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been stopped by police and felt like something about the encounter seemed wrong, unusual, or simply didn't make sense? Share your experience in the comments, because situations like that reveal a lot about how traffic stops really work. And later, I'll explain one mistake many drivers make when they assume police behavior automatically means everything happening is legal. Most people never expect to see an officer become the subject of an arrest. We're conditioned to think about traffic stops from one perspective. The officer walks up, the driver answers questions, documents are exchanged, warnings or citations are issued. The officer controls the encounter. But every once in a while the roles reverse, and when that happens, it creates an uncomfortable reality that many people don't like discussing. Police officers are human beings. That sounds obvious, but people often forget what it means. Human beings get tired. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings make poor decisions. Human beings can become impaired. The badge does not eliminate human weaknesses. In fact, one of the most important lessons drivers can learn is that authority and perfection are not the same thing. Imagine an officer working a shift late into the evening. Maybe dispatch traffic has been non-stop. Maybe there have been difficult calls. Maybe there has been emotional stress outside of work. Again, none of that excuses intoxication if it occurs, but understanding the human side helps explain why accountability systems exist in the first place. When reports emerge that an officer was arrested while on duty for suspected intoxication, people usually react in one of two ways. Some immediately defend the officer before hearing any evidence. Others immediately assume guilt before hearing any evidence. Both reactions skip something important. Facts. Evidence matters. Procedures matter. Observations matter. The same standards that apply to ordinary citizens should apply to officers as well. That principle is what maintains public trust. Now think about the irony involved. The same investigative techniques officers use every day may suddenly be used on one of their own. Observers notice driving behavior. Supervisors receive reports. Questions get asked. Field observations begin. People start paying attention to details that many drivers don't realize are significant. Was the vehicle maintaining lanes? Were there delayed reactions? Was communication clear? Were instructions followed correctly? Were movements coordinated? Those observations become part of the bigger picture. Many viewers are familiar with ordinary DUI investigations, but few understand how much attention officers pay to behavior long before formal testing ever begins. The process often starts with simple observations. An officer notices unusual driving. A supervisor notices unusual behavior. Another employee notices changes in speech patterns. Someone notices reactions that seem delayed. None of those observations alone automatically prove intoxication, but investigators are trained to look for patterns rather than isolated moments. That's important because drivers often misunderstand how traffic stops develop. Many people believe an officer instantly decides whether someone is guilty. Realistically, experienced officers are usually building a timeline. They're collecting observations. They're comparing behavior against expectations. They're evaluating explanations. They're trying to determine whether unusual behavior has an innocent explanation or something more serious behind it. Ironically, when an officer becomes the subject of that process, the same investigative logic generally applies. One reason this topic matters to ordinary drivers is because it exposes how traffic stop psychology actually works. Let's talk about pressure. Pressure changes behavior. A driver sees flashing lights, heart rate increases, hands tighten around the steering wheel, breathing changes, thoughts start racing. Even innocent people become nervous. Experienced officers know this. They expect nervousness. What they're often watching for is behavior that goes beyond ordinary nervousness. That's why questions sometimes seem repetitive. Where are you coming from? Pause. Where are you headed tonight? Pause. Have you had anything to drink? Pause. The officer may already know the answer doesn't necessarily matter as much as the delivery. Is the response immediate? Does it change? Does the story remain consistent? Does the driver become defensive? Body language becomes part of the evaluation. Now imagine those same observations being directed at an officer suspected of impairment. Suddenly, the badge no longer shields someone from scrutiny. Every movement matters, every answer matters, every pause matters. The public often imagines investigations as dramatic confrontations. In reality, many begin quietly. Someone asks a question. Someone notices an inconsistency. Someone requests clarification. The tension builds gradually, and tension is where many people make mistakes. Drivers do it all the time. An officer asks a routine question. The driver interprets it as an accusation. The driver becomes irritated. The driver's tone changes. The officer notices. Now the interaction feels different. The emotional temperature rises. What could have remained a straightforward encounter becomes complicated. That's one reason I constantly tell people to separate emotion from strategy during roadside interactions. Emotions are understandable. Strategy protects you. There is a major difference. A calm driver often has more control than an angry driver. A respectful driver often communicates more effectively than a confrontational one. That doesn't mean surrendering rights. It means exercising them intelligently. And this is where one of the biggest myths enters the conversation. Many people believe rights only matter when dealing with bad officers. That's completely backward. Rights matter because nobody can perfectly predict what kind of encounter they're having. You don't know what assumptions exist before the officer approaches. You don't know what information dispatch provided. You don't know what observations have already been made. You don't know whether another officer interpreted something incorrectly. You don't know whether someone reported your vehicle. Rights are not emergency tools reserved for extreme situations. They're everyday protections. Now let's return to the scenario of an on-duty officer suspected of intoxication. Imagine investigators begin asking questions. The officer knows procedures. The officer understands the system. The officer understands how reports are written. That creates an interesting dynamic. Knowledge can be beneficial. Knowledge can also create pressure. Because the officer understands exactly what certain observations might mean. The average citizen may not recognize the significance of a delayed answer. An experienced officer probably does. The average citizen may not realize why specific questions are being repeated. An experienced officer probably does. That awareness can make an investigation feel even more intense. Something else happens during these situations that rarely gets discussed. People start watching everyone, not just the officer. Supervisors, witnesses, investigators, other officers. Everyone's conduct comes under scrutiny, and it should. Accountability only works when procedures are applied consistently. The public pays close attention whenever law enforcement investigates one of its own. People want reassurance that standards are being enforced equally. If evidence exists, they want action. If evidence doesn't exist, they want fairness. Trust depends on both. Meanwhile, ordinary drivers can learn valuable lessons from these incidents. One lesson involves communication. Many people talk too much during traffic stops. That statement surprises some viewers. After all, isn't cooperation important? Yes, but cooperation and volunteering information are not identical concepts. Watch what often happens. An officer asks a simple question. The driver gives a 30-second answer, then a 1-minute answer, then a 5-minute explanation. Soon the driver is discussing things nobody even asked about. People become nervous and start filling silence. Silence makes them uncomfortable. But silence itself is not evidence. Many officers understand this. They know nervous drivers frequently talk themselves into trouble. The same principle applies in many investigations. Words create opportunities for misunderstanding. Words create inconsistencies. Words create new questions. Another situation that causes problems involves documents. A driver hands over a license, registration, proof of insurance. Then minutes pass. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The driver begins wondering what's happening. Anxiety grows. Some drivers become impatient. Others become suspicious. The reality is that several things could be occurring. Records checks, verification procedures, communication with dispatch, review of information, additional observations. But this waiting period affects behavior. People become emotionally invested in outcomes. That's why maintaining composure matters. The longer an encounter lasts, the greater the temptation to make impulsive decisions. And impulsive decisions rarely improve roadside situations. Consider another common scenario. An officer suddenly asks a driver to exit the vehicle. Many people immediately assume they're being arrested. Not necessarily. The request itself creates tension because it changes expectations. The driver had mentally prepared for a conversation through the window. Now the environment shifts. The driver is standing outside. Passing traffic feels louder. The situation feels more exposed. Heart rate increases. People start overthinking every movement. Investigators understand this. Behavior under changing conditions often reveals information. Sometimes innocent explanations become clearer. Sometimes concerns become stronger. Either way, observation continues. Now imagine an officer being asked to step out during an investigation into possible intoxication. The symbolism alone becomes powerful. Authority shifts. Control shifts. The officer experiences the same uncertainty many citizens experience during roadside encounters. What happens next often determines public perception. Professionalism matters. Transparency matters. Consistency matters. If procedures are followed correctly, confidence increases. If shortcuts appear, confidence decreases. That reality extends far beyond any single case. Let's talk about another roadside issue that drivers frequently misunderstand. Passengers. Passengers often believe they're invisible. They aren't. Officers observe passengers continuously. Movements, conversations, reactions, attempts to hide objects, attempts to retrieve objects, attempts to influence responses. Everything becomes part of the overall assessment. Sometimes passengers unintentionally create suspicion where none previously existed. A driver may be calm, then a passenger starts arguing. Another passenger begins reaching around the vehicle. Suddenly, attention shifts. The encounter changes. This is why experienced drivers understand that everyone's behavior affects the stop. One person's actions can influence the entire atmosphere. The same principle applies during